Incredibly talented writer, Mike Craven, Dave Campbell's Texas Football Magazine. You can go on Twitter at Craven Mike, on Twitter, and watch what he does covering college football, but a lot more. Mike Craven joins us. Hey, Mike, how you doing?
Doing good, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. There's a lot of things to get to. The article you have on Texas and A&M, Sam Houston State's Casey Keeler was on with us earlier. But I want to start with, did you really one night just go back and watch Baylor TCU 61-58?
I did. I'm working on a story, talking to some guys on the TCU side, the Baylor side that were in that game. Want to write a story for kind of leading into next week. So I needed to jog my memory, walk down memory lane, watch that, kind of find some of the bigger plays that happened. It was a lot of fun. I miss that kind of football.
Mike, what, now looking back a decade later on it, stuck out to you about the ridiculousness that was that game?
All verts. Like, it was like, I'm going to ask this to Bryce Petty and to Boykin when I talk to him later this week. Like, what was the percentage of vertical routes that were called? And so it was in the heyday of the air raid and just the going down deep vertical, right? Riles was doing that as well. So it was either a run, a very short swing pass, or a 50-yard bomb. There wasn't much in between that, and that kind of is different than what we've seen it evolve to now.
Mike, man, 10 years ago, huh? That's a long time ago, man. That's crazy. It's been that long. But we're getting A&M Texas back. We don't have quite the sizzle of TCU and Baylor, but what kind of hopes do you have for these two teams? That might be an interesting game here in a couple weeks if both can handle their business this weekend. They've obviously taken their lumps, but this was one of those protected Big 12 rivalries. What kind of hopes do you have that they can kind of rekindle some of that here in the next few years, sooner rather than later?
Yeah, I do think that November 30th game in College Station is going to be, one of the bigger games in recent memory in Texas college football. Historically, both of those teams aren't very good at the same time. I was kind of running through some numbers. 1975 is the only time Texas and Texas A&M each had a 10-win season in the same year. They have more years where they've won 6 or less when the other team has won 10 than having 8 or more wins in those years. So I think it's like when one of those teams in 36 times of winning 10 games, the other team averages like 6 wins a year. And so having them be 6-1 at the same time, both high up there in the SEC rankings, and also, obviously they hadn't played in a dozen years. So it's going to be a big one.
The ticket sales for that game, you could imagine, skyrocketing, the emotions, the first time in 12 years. And as you said, they're both pretty good. And this, we know Texas coming off what they did a year ago. They seem to be that they're going to be in there for the long haul. Why do you feel like this A&M team is not, they will hit the skids near the end of the year?
I think it's their ability to run the football and to play defense. You've watched a lot of football, right? Like, those things tend to travel and they tend to be more consistent week in and week out. They're not winning 52-49 and need to get some turnovers and things go their way. They are already the second best team in the SEC in giving up tackles for loss and sacks, and the third best team in the SEC in getting tackles for loss and sacks. And so they're creating negative plays on defense, and the offensive line isn't allowing very many on offense. Connor Weigman's probably the X factor for the Aggies. If he is the quarterback we saw against Missouri, A&M can play with most of the teams in the SEC. If he's the quarterback we saw against Notre Dame and somewhat against Mississippi State, I think that they're going to lose some of these bigger games against LSU, against Texas down the stretch.
They're much more efficient than they have been, and they're much more creative on either side of the ball than they have been in this coaching staff. They still have a lot of the talent that Jimbo brought in that was really good talent. They've lost some of that 5-star top-end stuff. Do you think that's what's going to maybe prevent them from breaking through against an LSU or Texas?
Yeah, it definitely could be. I think the guy that we're all kind of concerned about, or at least, looking to see if he reaches that potential, is Connor Weigman, and he is a former 5-star guy, right? Like, he was in that same class of Quinn Ewers, Cade Klubnik. Ewers ended up reclassifying, but there was real talk of who was the best player of those three, and now those three guys are leading top 20 teams in this country. I do think that they have enough talent, defensive line up front. Like Nick Skirton's considered a 3-star guy, but he led the Big Ten in sacks last year at Purdue. If he was re-ranked, he'd be a 5-star future first-round draft pick. So I think A&M has enough to hang in there. I'm just worried about the quarterback. Nussmeier at LSU is pretty established. He's had some big games. Quinn Ewers, despite the last effort, has had some big games. He's won a Big 12 championship. Connor Weigman's the one that we're still wondering about. And if he can live up to that hype, and we've seen him do it occasionally, if he can be that guy, A&M's going to have a really good chance to make the college football playoff. If he's not that guy, I think they end up, 8-4 with a really good season, but not one that can get you beyond that.
Mike, last week, Baylor went out to Lubbock and put a beat down, for lack of a better term, on Texas Tech. It was surprising for those of us that cover the team. Not that they won, because the Big 12 is what it is. Anybody can beat anybody, but the fashion was a little shocking. What was your take on both those teams coming out of that game? Tech obviously gets TCU in Fort Worth. Baylor gets a wounded Oklahoma State team. Maybe can string some things together, but how surprised were you, and where do you kind of have both those teams trajectory-wise coming out of that one?
Yeah, I was very surprised, and Baylor's played some really good football, just for 2 or 3 quarters of a game. We just haven't seen them put together a 4-quarter effort. They either start really fast like they did against Colorado and fall away, or we saw them start slow against BYU and make a comeback attempt. That Tech game was what Baylor can be at its best. Jake Spavital, Sawyer Robertson have been a really good partnership that makes a lot of sense for what Spav likes to run. Bryson Washington's emerged as a running back. They made some plays defensively. And so I think for Baylor, you look at it, you go back to film and you get together on Sunday and you go, guys, there's no reason we can't play like this every single week. And you look at their schedule, they could go on a real run and end up 7-5, right? And see what happens in 2025 and beyond. If you're Tech, I think it's a real concern. Like they've lost 4 times now at home since Joey McGuire's got there, which is a good record. But 2 of them have been blown out, by Baylor. Maybe that's just a scheme thing. Maybe they just don't match up against Texas Tech. But that was a bad one to win it or to lose at home. Now you go on the road where they have struggled under McGuire. All of a sudden, you could be on a 2-game losing streak, 5-4, and the fan base looking around and going, I thought we were going to compete for a Big 12 championship. Now it's just what bowl we're going to. And so a big game this week for the Red Raiders.
Mike, SMU's been fun to watch, and they're good, too, but they lost one of the weapons. They have a few, but R.J. Maryland, we've had him on this show. He was, I think, after he had won a couple of national awards. Your thoughts about the loss of what he means to that offense?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge loss. They probably lose to Nevada in week 1, if not for R.J. Maryland. He is absolutely their best weapon. He leads the team in receiving yards, receiving catches, touchdowns. Like, he is their number 1 target, even though he plays wide receiver. I do think with Kevin Jennings and what he's brought to that offense, they've averaged, I think, 45.8 points a game in the 4 games since he's been inserted as the starter. It's really unlocked them. He's great against the blitz. He's like 80% completion against the blitz. And so I do think with some of their other weapons, and they're going to have to step up. Guys like Jake Bailey, Keyshawn Smith, like Brashard Smith, like those guys are going to have to step up and play better football with larger roles. I think they can do it. I think they can still get to 9 or 10 wins, reach the ACC championship if they can get past Pitt in a couple of weeks. But it absolutely lowers their ceiling because R.J. Maryland was probably their best offensive weapon outside of their quarterback.
TCU on the other side of that Tech game has been quite the enigma this year, Mike. They have, again, this is a big offense they're going to play against. Their defense hasn't been good except for last week when they played Utah, who was reeling after, finally figuring out that Cam Rising's done. What do you make of the rest of their season and how they need to claw out of a hole?
It's been tough offensively for them because the first 5-6 weeks of the season, Josh Hoover was lighting it up. He wasn't turning the football over. He was carrying that offense, but you can tell defenses are loading up against the pass, kind of populating, dropping 7 or 8, and just daring TCU to run the football, and they just can't. Savion Williams was their leading rusher last week. That was basically him as a wide receiver playing Wildcat and just getting the ball snapped to him and running it, right? Like they didn't have a real run game. It cost them against UCF. That's why they gave up that second half lead. It cost them against SMU. They just kept throwing it. It was like Venus flytrap, right? They just kept throwing it to SMU. SMU kept returning it for touchdowns or for good field position. And so they need to find balance. And I just don't know how you do that in the middle of the season. Your offensive line is what it is. Your running backs are what they are. I just don't know if they're going to scheme their way to some kind of magical run game. And that's going to make it hard against good teams. They got lucky last week that Utah probably could have taken 10 quarters and not gotten to 20 points. And so, Tech can score. They can't stop many guys, but they can score. And so if TCU is going to be one-dimensional, I think that leads this to be, a favorite for Tech. But you look down and Vegas has TCU as almost a touchdown favorite. They're much smarter than I am.
Mike, we were doing a little pod, Big 12 action here, rolling through the teams and talking about Houston, who they now get Utah. They've had injuries. It's obviously a transition. Just how do you kind of view Houston? Is it all about just building just bricks one at a time? That TCU win was obviously really important, but just stacking those kinds of things and knowing, as unfortunate as this for older players, like, hey, you're kind of just laying the foundation. The winning's going to come thanks to what you guys do right now. How do you view the Cougs and what they've done up to this point?
Yeah, I think if you're Houston, you're just trying to steal some wins to kind of show proof of concept. You got that against TCU. You hope you get one or two more on the way out here. But Willie Fritz is Novocaine. Like, he's not trying to get in there and just work right away and get the quick fix. Like, give them some time. It always works. It was a slow burn at Tulane, and then they became, arguably the best G5 program in the nation by the time he left there. He did this at Sam Houston. He did it at Blinn. Georgia Southern was probably the only, or Georgia State was probably the only place he kind of hit the ground running and won right away. And so I think, even if you ask Houston, if you truth serum, the AD and the fan base, everybody knew it was going to be a slow process. Like, they're not as talented as they were the year before. It's about figuring out who on the roster you can build around and what you need, get some recruiting momentum. They're recruiting really well. So I kind of judge it by what they do off the field. Is the recruiting looking good? Is the admin happy? Like, what's the staff feeling like behind the scenes? And it does feel like they know this is going to be a 2-3 year process and they've signed up for it.
All right, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were going to write a book, right?
I did write a book.
And we don't have a copy. We need a copy so we can put it like up here on the desk the next time we're on the show if we get a copy from you.
Somebody send me an address and I'll shoot you one. I got one right here. Hold on.
All right. Yep, that's on your Twitter feed as well for those who want to go to the Twitter feed for Craven Mike. That's the book. It's a great book. It's a historical book. And we'll put it on the front like here in the mid-table. Now that it's over, can you try to explain, is it like trying to cram for 3 finals in college, or what was that experience once you actually sent it to the publishers and it was done?
Yeah, it's like digging a ditch, because I'm an article writer, and so by the time I write an article, I send it off to the editor. By the time I can hate it, it's already published. People are yelling at me, and I'm on to the next article, right? With the book, you work on it a couple hours a day. You wake up the next day and you just kind of go right back to it. You work on it a couple hours a day. And what's been hard for me, or what was hard for me, was not hating it by the time I was done with it, right? You read it so many times, you look over it so many times, you wonder if it's any good. By the time you got there, you kind of get, word blind, where you're kind of reading what you think you wrote and not editing it all that well. So it is much easier. My day job is much easier. I don't know how soon I will return to authorship, but it was a cool experience to kind of hold it for the first time. So yeah, give me an address and I will definitely shoot you one that way. And also, congrats on the Hall of Fame thing, by the way.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate that. I really do. That was amazing when I got the call a few weeks ago, and then yesterday it all became official. Was a fun day. I'll tell you that, no doubt about it. Thank you for your time. The Baylor 61-58. We were there. All of us were there, and still sometimes hard to imagine. But there have not been many great moments since that time against TCU for Baylor. And as you know, they're having the reunion of the 13 and 14 teams next week. And TCU has owned Baylor. I think it was a Charlie Brewer triple overtime win up in Fort Worth, and that's about it ever since that game.
Yeah, I'm excited to get up there. It's been fun talking to some of the former players and reminiscing about that game. Can't wait to get the article out and to go watch another TCU Baylor game. And most played intrastate rivalry in the state. They passed Texas A&M, so it's a big one.
Mike,
you,
will
man.
you be here before Saturday next week?
No, I'll be up there the second. That'll be the first time.
Okay. All right. Yeah, we were going to bring you into the studio if you were. Thanks for your time. Good luck with the article and also all of what you do covering the great state of Texas, but also the great sport of college football.